and a learner who was an actor who pretended to be a volunteer. Leo, please. Leo, no. No, Leo. Come on. Leo, please get out. Come on. Just fucked up my script. Hey y'all, my name is Sydney and welcome back to Planet Syd. Thank you guys so much for joining me. Today we are here at the Planet Syd radio station. I got me a nice little mic set up. You can see I'm still using this mic because I don't have the correct cord connector, whatever. It really doesn't matter. But yes, I hope you guys like the environment and the atmosphere that I have set here at the radio station. And today we are also drinking, I'm just drinking Great Powerade, but I put it in a nice little glass. And I also did put like some edible glitter in it, but it looks like it dissolved. Anyways, today we're going to be talking about the U.S. military and more so like the entire Department of Defense and just how bad it is. So if you guys are interested in that, then stay tuned. And I also do want to give a quick little disclaimer. When I say the U.S. military, I am referring to the entire Department of Defense. And if you did serve in the military, thank you for your service because somebody has to do it and it's not going to be me. I do want to just go over a few different experiences and scenarios that I think will put in a lot of context to some of the other situations that we're going to further discuss. So the first two that I do want to discuss is the Stanford prison experiment and the ZAP experiment. But the Stanford prison experiment took place at Stanford University in 1971, and it was conducted by Philip Zimbardo. And in an article from 1996 from Stanford, they said that his primary reason for conducting the experiment was for power of roles, rules, symbols, group identity, and situational validation of behavior that would genuinely repulse ordinary individuals. Basically, for this experiment, there was this makeshift prison. Again, it was at Stanford University. So there was a makeshift prison made in the basement of the psychology building. There was a group of male college students, and they all volunteered to be a part of the study. Some of them were assigned as guards, while others were assigned to be inmates. And to make this experiment feel as real as possible, they sent real police officers to arrest the inmates and take them to prison. And so they gave the quote unquote guards their own matching uniforms. And of course, the prisoners had their own uniforms as well to de-individualize them and also to keep the quote unquote prisoners from escaping so they know who's who. So long story short, if you've seen the film or if you just know of the Stanford prison experiment, this experiment got dark very, very quickly. It was originally intended to last 2 weeks, I believe, but on the 6th day is when it was stopped due to just how out of control it had gotten. And throughout this experiment, there was an alarming amount of psychological and sometimes physical abuse by the guards against the prisoners. And they sprayed the prisoners with a fire extinguisher for not complying with the wake-up call. They stripped the prisoners of their clothes. They removed their mattresses and sent the bad prisoners to the hole, which is supposed to simulate like maximum security, how it is in real prison. And the quote unquote good prisoners were rewarded with clothing, bed, and food. So basic necessities. And again, these are students who volunteer, fake prisoners, fake guards. And so as this is happening, the quote unquote good prisoners began to distance themselves from the bad prisoners due to fear of them being grouped up and being sent to the hole or maximum security and their privileges of food and bed and clothing getting revoked. And it got to the point to where one of the prisoners even had like a mental breakdown and had to leave due to the mistreatment. And that's when the experiment was shut down on the 6th day. And the person who shut it down was Christiana Maslach. She was visiting and observing the prisoners being abused and being forced to wear bags over their heads. And the bags over the heads, that sounds very familiar. We're going to revisit that later. But this experiment did cause a lot of controversy due to the questionable ethics and the reliability of it, because it really illustrates how drunk people can get off of their perceived power over another individual's life. And this could be a human psychology thing that just needs more research, and that has been researched, but I also feel like this is just an American thing. Because if this were an experiment with real guards and real prisoners in the real U.S. justice system, that would be one thing. It would still be unethical, in my opinion. But that would be one thing, and it's not. This particular experiment, these were students who volunteered to be guards and prisoners. And of course, you know, they're going to fully commit or whatever. But these were literally regular college students who knew that there were no crimes committed by the people who were the quote unquote prisoners. And the only thing that was deciding who was a guard and who was a prisoner was chance. Like, so you would think that even with these titles and these uniforms that these guards and prisoners are wearing, there would still be some level of a moral and ethical standard, but that wasn't the case, and I was wrong. And by the way, just a quick little disclaimer, I'm not saying if you do go to jail in real life, then you deserve to be treated poorly by the guards. That is awful. You deserve to be treated as a human. We're going to get into it. I'm just not surprised when it happens in the US specifically. Unfortunately, it's just unfortunate. But with the Stanford prison experiment, this particular subject did have limited research, but I did think that it was definitely some questionable things about this experiment, and I think that the results are pretty accurate or a good starting point when it comes to the abuse of power in the US justice system. And honestly, I would love to see this experiment done in other countries, like one in Venezuela, because that prison system is even worse in the US, which I can't even imagine, and one in Norway, where they have an idealized version of prison. But I don't know, I'm not a psychologist, but I do feel like it's pretty accurate and safe to say that in a general sense, Americans are kind of socialized to be shitty people, and the Venezuelan prison system is pretty awful, but Norway is considered one of the best. So maybe I shouldn't be shocked by the Stanford prison experiment, but I still am. However, with that out of the way, I do also want to talk about the Milgram experiment too, because I feel like these psychological experiments really help contextualize some of the behaviors of the people in the US military. But if you haven't heard of what the Milgram experiment is, it is also referred to as the electric shock experiment. And the Milgram experiment is a psychological experiment that explores people's willingness to obey people in positions of authority. They did this by having an experimenter who was in charge of the experiment, who was the teacher, and this was a volunteer, but they weren't aware that they were actually a part of the experiment. They just thought they were volunteering to assist, and a learner who was an actor who pretended to be a volunteer. And basically, the quote unquote experimenter would give the quote unquote teacher instructions to experiment electric shocks to the quote unquote learner if the learner said a wrong answer on a questionnaire. And so the electric shocks were actually connected to a voice recording that would give the teacher the impression that the learner was being seriously harmed. So it would say things like ouch, and it would try and urge the teacher to like stop, and like basically through every shock you would just get more and more hurt, and you could hear that through the audio. But as the experiment went on, the quote unquote experimenter would urge the teacher to continue, and the teacher would end up obeying. And these are both very controversial experiences because they kind of open up this door to a wider conversation on if situational variables can explain things like perpetrators of genocide and the bystander effects, for example. And I'm only mentioning this because as I was researching for this video, the one question that I kept on asking myself is, why are these people committing such atrocious acts in reference to the US military? And that's still a question that I still have, but this did help contextualize some of that. Because again, there were a lot of things that played into tragedies like Abu Ghraib, and I believe that these experiments help contextualize some part of that. But of course, also let's not get it twisted. Let's not get it twisted. Hate, dehumanization, and ignorance also play a very large part in a lot of these tragedies as well. But anyways, that was a lot. So I'm happy that we finally got out the way and we could finally get into the military part of this video. There is a trickle down effect of commands and powers that starts with the White House and then makes its way through the chain of command from the Pentagon all the way through the chain of command and then through the different branches of the military. So there is a lot of different ears and eyes and everything that these commands kind of have to go through. So sometimes it isn't as simple as somebody just acting on impulse or out of hate, even though it still is questionable. But I do want to briefly touch on the socialization of the individuals when there is this trickle down effect of these commands, and it's from this entity that's telling you who your enemies are literally and what you need to do to survive and that you need to protect your country and this, that, and the third. I feel like this is important because there's such a deep level of dehumanization that occurs whenever there are war crimes and genocide, and it's just normalized, and it's like you're literally being told where to go, what to eat, who to kill, and what to do, everything. And that kind of reminds me of the psychology experiments because to some degree, it's the same thing. You have these superiors, whether they're in your face or across the globe in some random office, and they're telling you what you need to do, and you are obeying. And there's so much patriotism that is ingrained in us as Americans from such a young age. If you went to school here in the US, then you know that we literally say the Pledge of Allegiance every day. And there's so much propaganda that paints the military in this heroic light. Obviously, people now see that it's kind of bullshit, but there's still people who can be tricked or whatever. But yeah, until you learn to unlearn that and just to question some of the things that we've been shown, you just don't really know. Also, I do want to also say that decades ago when men were getting drafted, it's understandable why most just went to war. Like, not everybody's going to be a draft dodger. I don't know what I would have done if God forbid if they start drafting people right now and they start drafting women, I will break my fucking leg. I'm not doing it. I'm not doing it. We've been programmed to view the military as this unstoppable force, and that's keeping you and your country, quote unquote, safe. So if they are asking you to join, you should feel honored and you should want to join and you should want to protect your country. Even though they're not really asking, especially if you're drafted, like you don't really have an option anyways. I mean, you can dodge, but then you playing with your freedom after that. But yeah, it was and it is still illegal to not register for selective service, and it is a felony to dodge the draft still to this day. And of course, there were people out there and still out there today who are bold enough to dodge the draft, but there is a chance that if they were caught and persecuted, they could be in jail for up to 5 years, or they would have to pay a fine. And for some people are willing to gamble that and other people are not. But anyways, regardless though, if you dodged the draft and became a felon, you had a criminal record, which kind of changes the trajectory of your life. And that goes to varying degrees, just depending on race, class, gender, all that stuff. So between propaganda and the draft, it made sense why most just went along with joining the military and supporting it, because there really wasn't that much of a choice to begin with. And I mean, there was always this counterculture movement and that were anti-war, specifically during the Vietnam War, that included veterans who were against the war. But even now in 2025, when everyone has access to social media, and we can see in real time what's happening in other countries and the atrocities that the US is currently funding and still is funding, it's kind of hard to ignore it and not be disillusioned if you weren't disillusioned already before. And also, to go back to the socialization aspect, there is so much socialization that happens to people whenever they join the military and go to basic training, all the way up to being on the front lines. So if there was some sort of ethical overstepping, I would assume that some would behave certain ways because they think that they can get away with certain behaviors, not because they think it's okay. Also, I think that this socialization can result in more nefarious actions because it can foster an environment of moral degeneracy, and it goes unchecked until it's too late. Adults know right from wrong, and there are just some things that in my eyes are just inexcusable. And I just wonder how many people in the military do certain things for the sake of compliance, even if they feel personally uncomfortable with whatever the action is, versus how many people do things with the intention of harming another. Like, it's both still pretty ethically muddy, but I'm just curious. I guess we'll never fully know, but the concept of obedience and compliance is just so strong, and it's shocking when sometimes people who serve look back on their time in the military and are either deeply traumatized or they are just repulsed by their actions, and they just don't want to talk about it for a multitude of reasons. It is still traumatic in and of itself, even if you do everything perfectly in the military. Also, on another hand, I'm not going to act like everybody who joins the military is always this preyed upon person. Like, there is some predatory recruitment techniques that they use that I do not agree with, which we will talk about later. I don't think it's a stretch to say that I feel like some people join the military with the intention of abusing their power, whether that be over their comrades or civilians, foreign and domestic, and even their quote unquote opponents. Because some actions, even in war, are just inhumane. And there have been so many instances of the US military covering up alleged sexual assaults, the multitude of war crimes that have been committed allegedly, and I don't even have words for whatever the hell keeps on happening at the Fort Hood military base, which has been renamed to Fort Cavazos. I don't know how to pronounce it. Like, it's always something there, and it's fucking ridiculous. They just shut that base down. But there seems to be this continued effort to protect abusers and potential criminals who are in the military while leaving the abused kind of left in the dust. But there's something about the ranks and these uniforms that give these corrupted individuals some power trip. And they kind of just become and act like they are infallible, because in a way they are. Like, they end up being protected by this institution that has overall had amazing PR. Sometimes some would disagree. But you can still be dishonorably discharged and even have charges brought against you if you're caught breaking laws while serving. But this isn't just with the military. This can also be seen with cops as well. And again, nobody in 2025 likes the police, but they can still go out and kill. Nobody in 2025 likes the police, but they can still. But generally speaking, nobody in 2025 likes the police, but they can still go out and kill unarmed civilians just because they can, and go home, and they get to abuse their family sometimes, and they might get jail time. It's not even a guarantee. I do believe that there are some people who join the military with the intention to abuse their power, while also there are other people who join the military in hopes of paying for college or getting financial stability or getting their Camaro or whatever. But I just wonder how much of a chance does a person really have at being decent when they're joining an organization that's so corrupt. And I don't think it's a matter of good and bad because, again, there's a lot of nuance needed for this conversation. But I do wonder if there's any good that can come from joining the military in this day and age. But I just wonder, even if a person has the best intentions, and even if this person is considered the most morally upright person, what would you do if you were in a situation where you're being told you have to do something in order to quote unquote survive? But this thing that you're being told to do is wrong, but you also feel like you're being forced into an environment where others aren't behaving as they should. Like, would you comply if you're just alone and across the world and you're only surrounded by other people in the same group? Or would you push back and possibly risk retaliation? I'm only posing this question because there could be a huge cost to not complying in the military, and it doesn't necessarily have to involve your superiors either. There's this camaraderie that comes with joining the military, and it makes sense because you go through all this training together and you get to travel the world with these people. So I understand that there's this strong bond that is formed. There have been instances of people being victims of sexual assault or people having to be whistleblowers out of fear of risking retaliation and being socially outcast in an organization that you dedicated your life to. And so there is so much to lose when you go against such a powerful organization. And so I can see why some might feel that it is a better decision to either comply or to just put your head down and pretend you don't see anything going on. Now I want to get into a few different scenarios where the US military has shown how deplorable they are. And so I feel like the first thing that I have to start with, which we probably already know, is the atomic bomb. But I feel like that would be a little bit redundant. Oppenheimer did recently did premiere. It's common knowledge that the US is the first and only country to drop an atomic bomb. Yes, I do just want to say RIP to all of the victims and families, and Godspeed to the generations of people that are still affected by that atomic bomb to this day. I do want to go over Vietnam, specifically the Cold War in Vietnam and Agent Orange and the My Lai massacre. On BBC.com, they perfectly summed up the main reasons why the US became involved in the Vietnam War. And basically, Vietnam was previously a part of the French Empire until the French left due to the Treaty of Geneva in 1954, which led Vietnam split into two countries, North Vietnam, which was a communist republic, and South Vietnam, which was a capitalist republic. And they were supposed to be divided until the next election, but that never happened. So eventually a civil war broke out because North Vietnam wanted the entire country to be under one communist agenda. And the citizens of South Vietnam were supportive of this as well because they didn't like the leader. But then the US took it upon themselves to get involved in this civil war due to the fear of the domino theory happening, which basically means that if one country supports communism, then the neighboring countries will also begin to support communism as well. And this was a solid theory because it already happened in Eastern Europe. And another reason is that the South Vietnamese government was weak. It eventually was overthrown. I'm going to hope I say his name correctly. I'm going to put it on the screen. Ngo Dinh Diem. And he did not want to give land to any poor people, and he did not respect Buddhism, so they really weren't messing with him. And lastly, the Gulf of Tonkin incident, where the North Vietnamese boats attacked USS Maddox on August 2nd in 1964. Then 2 days later, allegedly another attack had taken place, but nothing was confirmed. In this article, it says that, quote, however, in Washington, the attack was presented as fact, and the incident gave the USA the excuse it needed to escalate the war. U.S. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara withheld information about U.S. support of South Vietnamese raids on North Vietnamese radar stations and other targets in the period leading up to the attack. Other evidence that suggested the second attack had not occurred was not passed on to the U.S. Congress. And the U.S. Congress gave President Lyndon B. Johnson permission to wage war on North Vietnam, and the first major contingent of U.S. Marines arrived in 1965. For the next decade, the USA's involvement only increased, and by 1968, over 500,000 American troops were in Vietnam, and the war was costing over $77 billion a year. $77 billion a year. And that was in 1968. So I don't even know how much $77 billion is in 2025 dollars, but still spending that much in general, but spending that much a year is just fucking ridiculous. So yeah, that was a little history lesson that I got off of BBC.com about the Vietnam War because I had to refresh my little high school brain or whatever. How do you escalate an ongoing war over something that may or may not have even happened? And as you all know, the Vietnam War took place between 1955 and 1975, and throughout this time frame, a lot happened, which resulted in the general consensus surrounding the U.S. military and the government just being really negative. That's when we get the anti-war movements and everything. So they weren't doing too well. A lot of the veterans who did serve in the U.S. military at that time were considered traitors and not heroes. And there was a strong divide between Americans who supported the war versus Americans who did not. And this was also an interesting time because there were always going to be people who are anti-war, but in the real-time documentation of the war, in contrast to what the U.S. government was telling the public, were so starkly different. Like, they just be lying. They just be lying. So when people finally started to catch on that they were being lied to, that's when they really kind of stopped rocking with the U.S. government. And so that revelation is what really affected the public perception of the U.S. during that time. And honestly, it's what led to the end of the war. Well, the documentation of the Vietnam War really highlighted the brutality and the ugliness of the U.S. military's involvement in this particular war. And at this time, a majority of the conversations surrounding the war were about if the U.S. military were committing war crimes and just the ethics of war in general. And the specific incident that really turned off a lot of people was the My Lai massacre. The My Lai massacre happened on March 16th in 1968, and a group of American soldiers, the Charlie Company, they unalived an entire village of unarmed civilians in South Vietnam. The civilians included women, children, and the elderly, and it's estimated that it was over 500 unarmed civilians that were massacred. There was even evidence that some of the young girls, underage girls, were R-worded and mutilated before they were unalived. To make matters even worse, the U.S. Army covered this up for an entire year before it was even reported to the American press. That's not good. So what happened was that day, the Charlie Company was under the impression that the Viet Cong guerrillas were taking over the neighboring village, so they were sent to My Lai on a search and destroy mission. However, when they showed up, they observed a quiet, peaceful village, and everyone was getting prepared to eat their breakfast rice. And again, it's women, children, and elderly people. So they for sure, like 1,000%, had nothing to do with the war, and they knew that. And the person who was in charge of the Charlie Company was Lieutenant William Calley, and he still ordered the soldiers to round everyone up and to begin shooting them. And so furthermore, on history.com, it states that, quote, some soldiers balked at Calley's command, but within seconds the massacre had begun, with Calley himself shooting numerous men, women, and children. Mothers who were shielding their children were shot, and when their children tried to run away, they were too slaughtered. Huts were set on fire, and anyone who tried to escape was gunned down. Somebody said, quote, I saw them shoot an M79, which is a grenade launcher, into a group of people who were still alive, but it was mostly done with a machine gun. They were shooting women and children just like anybody else, end quote. And that is from Sergeant Michael Bernhardt, who was a soldier at the scene, who later told the reporter, quote, we met no resistance, and I only saw 3 captured weapons. We had no casualties. It was just like any other Vietnamese village. Old Papa Sams, which is men, old men, women, and kids. And as a matter of fact, I don't remember seeing one military-age male in the entire place dead or alive, end quote. That's what Bernhardt said, the person who was there at the My Lai massacre. And so in addition to killing these unarmed men, women, and children, the soldiers slaughtered countless livestock, R-worded a number of unknown women, and burned the entire village down to the ground. And the person who was in charge, Lieutenant Calley, he was reported to have dragged dozens of people, including young children, into a ditch before executing them with a machine gun. Just to further clarify, if you have any confusion, not a single shot was fired against the Charlie Company. So there was no sort of confrontation. They just went in there guns blazing. And so that entire massacre was barbaric, to say the least. What makes this so infuriating is just that by observing the people in the village, it was very easy for everyone to come to the conclusion that these were normal, harmless civilians. There was not a single military-aged man there in the village, but they still decided to go ahead and slaughter these people and do God knows what to all the women and children. And the only thing that put a stop to this entire massacre was when an Army helicopter pilot, his name was Warrant Officer Hugh Thompson, Chief Glenn Andriata, and helicopter gunner Lawrence Colburn, when they quote-unquote landed his aircraft between the soldiers and the retreating villagers and threatened to open fire if the soldiers continued their attacks. They said that, quote, we kept on flying back and forth, and it didn't take very long until we started noticing the large number of bodies everywhere. Everywhere we look, we see bodies. They were infants, 2, 3, 4, 5-year-olds, women, very old men, no draft age men, end quote. And that's what Thompson said at a Miley conference at Tulane University in 1994. And so after they intervened with the massacre, they proceeded to help get the remaining survivors to safety. And after this atrocity, there was, of course, an internal investigation in the military. But the higher-ups in the Charlie Company and the entire 11th Brigade began to downplay the severity of the incident and attempted to do a cover-up of the Miley massacre. Even though there was this quote-unquote internal investigation, the Army was very intentional about making sure that this did not end up being reported on. And in the same article on history.com that I was reading earlier, it says that, quote, among the U.S. Army's internal investigators of the Miley massacre was Major Colin Powell, who later became Secretary of State under President George W. Bush. So according to Powell's report, he said that, quote, although there may be isolated cases of mistreatment of civilians and prisoner of war, this by no means reflects the general attitude throughout the division. And this is specifically regarding the atrocities committed by American soldiers. And he further states that, quote, in direct refutation of this portrayal is the fact that relations between American division soldiers and the Vietnamese people are excellent, end quote. So the article continues and says that the quote unquote cover up of the My Lai massacre continued until somebody named Ron Riedenhauer, who was also a soldier in the 11th Brigade, who had heard reports of the massacre, but he had not participated in it. He began a campaign to bring the events to light. He ended up writing a letter to President Richard M. Nixon, the Pentagon, the State Department, the Joint Chiefs of Staffs, and several congressmen. No response. So then he finally decides to give an interview to an investigative journalist, Seymour Hersh, who ended up breaking the story in 1969. And so a whole 20 months later went by. 2 whole years went by after the My Lai massacre happened before it even hit the news. And I'm only bringing this up because I find it so mind-boggling that there were witnesses who were there and witnessed the incident and also expressed their discomfort but still ended up obeying and taking the orders. But again, this goes back to the concept of compliance and obedience. But it's shocking that it took someone who was also in the military and serving in Vietnam but not present during that specific massacre to hear what happened by word of mouth, who took it upon himself to take it to the press. And again, before it even reached the press, he tried to reach out to multiple high-ranking congressmen and government officials, 24 U.S. congressmen to be exact, and he was met with radio silence by all of them. It just seems like the U.S. military, which isn't surprising, but it seems like they just had no interest in anything that could possibly be bad PR, even if there were lives that were lost, which is nothing new, but it's still shocking to say the least. And it's shocking that still Ron, who was the person who was the whistleblower, who was also a member of the U.S. military, was basically hand delivering the information to the government, and they still chose to turn a blind eye. Even after the investigative journalist Seymour Hersh, he broke the story, the Department of Defense finally conducted an investigation which resulted in Lieutenant William Calley and the 26 other U.S. soldiers being charged with criminal offenses. Lieutenant Calley was the only one convicted, though. And I do also want to emphasize that they were not tried as war criminals due to a law in, quote, Article 4 of the 4th Geneva Convention, which excluded Allied civilians from the status of protected persons in an internationally armed conflict. He was instead charged with 6 counts of premeditated murder of 109 civilians. He was sentenced to life in prison, which kind of got mixed reviews from the general public. Like, they feel like they made him a scapegoat because, of course, he was the one in charge, but there were also other people who participated in this, and also he received orders from somebody else, so he should not have been the only one going to jail. But that didn't really matter anyways, because President Nixon decided that he should be on house arrest just after him serving 3 days of his life imprisonment. And so eventually his sentence was reduced to 20 years, and then 3 years later, Calley filed an appeal basically saying that the publicity of the trial affected the outcome, which could be argued, and he was set free on bail and his sentence was reduced to 10 years. He was sent back to custody on June 13th in 1974, and after a series of appeals, he was released again on September 25th in 1974. So basically by this time, he was still quote unquote serving his 10-year sentence and was eligible for parole. And so he only served 3 days in prison and the rest of his sentence was house arrest. And that was what he got for unaliving 109 civilians. But yeah, it is kind of just like that gray area of compliance, because he was getting the orders from somebody, and also there were other people who were complying with his orders that he was getting from somebody. The military justice system is just a hot ass fucking mess. Like, I won't say it's not real, but like, if you kill 109 people here in the United States and you're just a regular civilian, you're not getting 3 days in jail and a couple of years on house arrest. Anyway, search and destroy missions are nothing new, but this was by far one of the most horrific cases. And there were a lot of different war tactics on each side. So the US did have the advantage of machinery and just having this big budget and all these weapons and everything. But the one thing that the Vietnamese did have on their side is that they knew the terrain better than anybody, because it was their home. Throughout the war, there were definitely a lot of war crimes being committed, and torture was used as a tactic to get the civilians to talk, and everything got pretty gruesome very quickly. And there was this meeting called the Russell Tribunal, or the International War Crimes Tribunal, where different anti-war activists, advocates for peace, philosophers, and scientists will meet up to discuss philosopher Bertrand Russell's findings after a year of researching America's part in the intervention of the Vietnam War. And I do want to make it clear that this convening of all these different individuals had no judicial authority. This was just simply to raise awareness on their findings that they had. And so this happened on December 1st in 1967. And the New York Times did state that, quote, tribunal members unanimously found the United States, quote, guilty on all charges, including genocide, the use of forbidden weapons, maltreatment and unaliving of prisoners, violence and forceful movement of prisoners, end quote. And this is in reference to Vietnam and its neighbors in Laos and Cambodia. So across two separate sessions between May 2nd and May 10th in 1967 in Stockholm, and between November 20th and December 1st in 1967 in Roskilde, the members ended up weighing the evidence that they had each found during several fact-finding trips to Vietnam between the two sessions, and these missions allowed tribunal members to assess the damage the war had brought on civilians and verify the first-hand claims heard during the tribunal's first session. One such mission, which included the labor activist Lawrence Daly, the journalist Tariq Ali, and the writer Carol Brightman, returned with indisputable proof that the United States Air Force had deliberately bombed civilian facilities and infrastructures, including hospitals, schools, churches, and villages. Other members who scouted the countryside encountered civilians who agreed to travel to Denmark and to speak before the tribunal's second session. The first witness was a 37-year-old Vietnamese farmer. And while he was there, he exposed his charred body before the tribunal and explained through an interpreter that an American plane had dropped phosphorus bombs on his family farm while he plowed the field. And he wasn't alone, so it was victim after victim coming up during this meeting. And they basically described how these American interrogators swept through villages looking for enemies and torturing civilians for information, even if they didn't have any information. And one former American interrogator, his name is Peter Martinson, he confirmed with the tribunal that the Army Intelligence School taught interrogational techniques that violated the Geneva Conventions. And he literally said that, quote, interrogators participated in actual torture, end quote, and he said that before commenting on methods that he occasionally resulted in the death of Vietnamese prisoners of war. And later in 1970, additional interrogators and Vietnamese people confirmed that they had been waterboarded, shocked, and burned by the U.S. military. And even outside of that, a few of them even shared how they were assaulted and how they were sodomized as well, with snakes and sticks being pushed into their bodies. And one survivor said that, quote, it's so horrifying to recall an interrogation where you beat the fellow to get an effect, and then you beat him out of anger, and then you beat him out of pleasure. And further testimonies also revealed that the United States had forcefully relocated civilians to further isolate and better isolate them from the enemy. And so this strategic Hamlet program, for example, forced large populations of people into sanctioned districts in order to pacify rural villages and halt the communist infiltration into the countryside. Witnesses testified that American soldiers murdered resistors and burned villages as they relocated Vietnamese civilians. American bombers and artillery would then subject the reported empty village to bombs and artillery fire before covering the area with chemical defoliants. With these tactics, it really kind of erased all of these different livelihoods and survivors had no choice but to abandon hope and move their families to the prepared hamlets. The tribunal members were equally worried about the military's use of advanced weaponry in areas populated by civilians, and so one particular bomb gave them pause because its design seemed the intent only to inflict mass casualties. So they had a weapons expert. His name was Jean-Pierre Vaguier of the University of Paris. He testified before the tribunal that the so-called guava bomb, which is a type of cluster bomb, would send 300 iron balls of shrapnel into every direction upon explosion. The bomb itself did little damage to concrete and steel, but it appeared as if it was only created to tear through flesh of human bodies. And he ended up saying that, quote, "I don't see any conclusion that except bombing the civilians is a deliberate policy of the Pentagon, presumably in hopes of inducing them to bring pressure on their government to surrender." And that is what Daly concluded upon hearing the testimony. What was really different about this time is that they really have firsthand accounts from people who survived and who were deeply affected by the U.S. military's involvement. They really have firsthand accounts from these civilians and such damning evidence of war crimes from research that they conducted on their own. And so it's really kind of hard to dismiss the findings of these hearings. But the U.S. did try, though. They tried, because this made them look really bad. This did not stop the war, and this meeting took place in 1967, and the war didn't conclude until 1975, so it really didn't stop much. But this did help fuel the overall global anti-war movement. And I also want to briefly touch on racism in the military during the time period, because during the duration of this war, there was also a lot going on back in America with the growth of the civil rights movement. There was a higher percentage of Black people being drafted than there was of Black people in the US, which is interesting because Jack Helms was saved on the draft board for nearly a decade. And if you don't know who that is, he was a Grand Wizard of the KKK. And there was a very low percentage of Black people in higher ranks as well. So of course, this is just typical racism and discrimination, and it was obviously very normalized. But it really escalated after the assassination of MLK. And there are reports of instances of troops wearing KKK robes, flying the Confederate flag, and cross burnings. But while this was all going on, everybody was breathing in something called Agent Orange. Agent Orange is an herbicide that was sprayed all over the forest and crops in Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. And it was basically to disintegrate the forest so that the Viet Cong couldn't have anywhere to cover, because, again, they kind of had the home court advantage. And so they couldn't have the advantage if there was no court left. That was their method. And it was reported that the U.S. sprayed more than 20 million gallons of these chemicals, and they were dubbed the rainbow herbicides because they all had various effects, but the Agent Orange was by far the most dangerous. The United Nations did actually try to object to the use of biological and chemical warfare due to the unknown side effects of it to humans and the environment, which is a violation of the Geneva Protocol. But the US, they began to argue that Agent Orange was an herbicide, not a chemical. There are various tests on including animals that found that Agent Orange was unsafe, so its use was suspended in 1970. Still, Agent Orange was already out there in the ecosystem, and it still deeply affects the population of Vietnam to this day. There were millions of people who were found to have high concentration of Agent Orange in their breast milk and blood, and Agent Orange is linked to multiple forms of cancer and genetic disorders. There were dioxins in the soil, so it's basically impossible for reforestation and for the food chain to recover. And the highest concentration of dioxins were found at all the US base camps in Vietnam. So this also had a terrible effect on veterans as well, and this can still be seen to this day. I did just want to talk about Agent Orange and the Vietnam War as a whole. I don't want to talk about weapons since we are already on the topic of war, more specifically the 1033 program and the militarization of the police here in the US, and these war tactics that are being used on civilians. I do want to define what militarization is, just so we can be clear. So vocabulary.com would define militarization as the process of becoming ready for conflict of war. Sometimes militarization refers to making a civilian organization resemble the armed forces with uniforms or weapons. For example, when a country prepares itself for war, that's militarization. So now I do want to discuss the 1033 program. And the 1033 program basically gives weapons and other miscellaneous items that are no longer in use by the U.S. military. They give it to law enforcement agencies. And the 1033 program was a part of the National Defense Authorization Act that was introduced in September of 1996. And what's so interesting about this particular program is that it literally militarizes the U.S. law enforcement agencies because they're literally giving them the tools. And this specific program is why we sometimes see police officers with rifles instead of handguns. The thing that irks me the most about it is that it kind of creates this warlike environment, and these are just regular, normal U.S. communities. Like, it shouldn't be that. And this can really foster like an us versus them mindset, which isn't a good thing to have when you're holding a rifle. And that's not a good thing to experience being on the other end of that rifle. And also it's just irritating because sometimes these are simple situations to where there just needs to be some de-escalating, but they end up skipping all those steps and jumping straight to using excessive force in a situation that really didn't call for that. And also, if there is any military equipment, there is military style training, which opens up an entire new can of worms that we'll discuss later on in this video. But yeah, as I was researching for this video, I did come across a study that was done about the correlation between the 1033 program and police violence. And it was interesting to say the least. The research was conducted by Casey Delahanty, Ryan Welch, Jack Mewhirter, and Jason Wilkes. And I'll link the full research article down below. Also, I'll link all of the sources I cited. Everything will be in the description box. Basically, in this research, they looked at different states and they compared the amount of civilians who were killed by law enforcement agencies before and after they received equipment due to the 1033 program. And one state that they looked at in particular was Nevada in 2013, and they concluded that there were at least one civilian killed by law enforcement agencies in counties that received equipment through the 1033 program compared to no killings in counties that didn't receive any equipment. So there has to be some sort of correlation between the people that are getting these military style weapons and the law enforcement agencies and these civilians being unalived. As I was going through this research, they included this quote, and I feel like that really perfectly sums up the militarization of the police force. It says that, quote, "I suppose it is tempting if the only tool you have is a hammer is to treat everything as if it were a nail." Abraham Maslow from the Psychology of Science of Recognizance said. And that really reminds me of the devastating ordeal that happened with Michael Brown, which we all know he was an unarmed black man who was unalived in Ferguson by a police officer, and there were peaceful protests afterwards. But after that, the riots ensued, and the community of Ferguson was rightfully so grieving and very angry. The police thought it was a good response to show up in full 1033 gear, and immediately it kind of changes the atmosphere. Like, I can see why it can kind of create this us versus them scenario. As of right now, there has been over $7 billion worth of equipment that the U.S. military has given to law enforcement agencies since 1996. I'm going to insert a screenshot of the act that was introduced just so you can see it for yourselves, and also in the description box I'm going to include a link to the website, the Marshall Projects. And that has a list of all the law enforcement agencies that benefit from the 1033 program. So if you guys just want to take a peek at that, maybe you'll see your city. You won't see Planet Sid up there. But anyways, as I was going through that list on the Marshall Projects, I couldn't help but notice that the state of New York received over $26 million worth of equipment, which is interesting. I've never personally been to New York City, so I'm saying this completely as an outsider. But if you live in New York City, specifically with everything that's going on with the subways and everything, leave a comment down below if you have any further insight or anything. I did find this interesting because there is, as far as I'm aware, there is still this huge militarized police presence in the New York City subway system that was deployed to help control the crime. However, it really doesn't seem like much has changed, and it seems like things have literally gotten worse, because every time you Google the New York City subway, you'll find countless articles about somebody who was recently randomly attacked, or it was really unfortunate of that situation of that person who was set on fire. Didn't that happen like a few times? But the last update that I saw was that the National Guard was making their presence known by patrolling, and eventually they started checking everyone's bags before entering the subway. And they were doing all this while carrying military-grade rifles, which is off-putting to say the least. I can't imagine just going on my way to work, because a lot of people in New York use the subway as a means of everyday transportation, and then having to encounter that level of militarization every single day. New York City is a very densely populated area, so I feel like to a degree crime is unavoidable, but I do think that that heavy of a police presence with a military grade rifles is just not the correct way to go about it. It's not making anybody feel safer. If anything, it just makes the environment worse. And still, all these incidents are still happening, and it seems like the police just can't get anywhere fast enough whenever some shit really is popping off. It really doesn't help when we're talking about people of color, more specifically Black people. However, while this is happening in New York, there is a lot more happening in Georgia. First off, there is I'm not sure if it's called the Gilly program or Gilee. But outside of that program, there's also Cop City, which we've heard about and which we all know. And so to start with the Gilly program, that stands for the Georgia International Law Enforcement Exchange. And basically, this is a program that facilitates law enforcement trainings between Georgia law enforcement and the Israeli police. This program was founded by Dr. Robert R. Friedman in 1996 for the Summer Olympics in Atlanta in fear that there would be another terrorist attack. And so Georgia State University would hold trainings where officers from around the world, including Israel, would go to Atlanta to get community police training. And so Georgia law enforcement officers would also visit Israel for a counterterrorism training. And so this is now a global issue, but this is also something that militarizes the police and is aiding in the conversion of the city of Atlanta into this surveillance state. And the Gilly program, along with Cop City, of course. And earlier I said that where there's military style equipment, there's also military style training. And this is what I'm talking about. Because of all the programs and initiatives, they all bleed into one another. So if you don't know about Cop City, which I'm sure you do, but we can briefly go over that. It is an 85-acre police training facility that is currently under construction in Atlanta, Georgia. There has been a tremendous amount of pushback against the construction of Cop City due to the aiding of it further militarizing the police force, and it just seems so unnecessary. But there are a lot of videos that dive into the construction and just the whole background of Cop City, so I don't want to get in too deep. But I do also want to point out that I did see something interesting as I was researching. So this facility was actually built on land that has a very interesting history, as all American land does, because this isn't ours. My ancestors wasn't here by choice, so shout out to the Native Americans and the indigenous folks and the slaves. Specifically with the land for Cop City, it was built on land that previously once belonged to the Muskogee people. I think that's how you say it. But they were a group of indigenous people, and they were forcibly removed from present-day Southeast Atlanta and relocated to Oklahoma due to the Trail of Tears. So that's awful in and of itself. But then what's even more interesting is that that land was then purchased by the U.S. government and was eventually used as the Atlanta prison farm. And basically it was used by people who were incarcerated to harvest food for other prisons in the region. And I feel that that is just so prophetic in a way. It's like prophetic in like the worst way possible. Like there's this piece of land that was occupied originally by Native Americans, rightfully so. It was their land. And then the U.S. government forcibly removes them, slaughters them, this, that, and the third. And then just for that same land to be owned by the U.S. government and use it basically for slave work because it's owned by the U.S. government for other prisoners. And then just for that land eventually to be turned into this place that's going to militarize the police force, and just further terrorize its citizens. As of right now, at least as I was writing this, it seems like the plans for Cop City is here to stay. I started working on this video a long time ago, so looks like it's happening, and it doesn't really matter how much pushback there is. There have been multiple protests, multiple arrests, and people being charged with domestic terrorism. But it seems that the state of Georgia is really taking a lot of steps that anybody who opposes the construction of Cop City, that they just feel discouraged and disempowered, and getting charged with domestic terrorism can really fuck up your life. And so as I was researching, I came across this article in The Guardian by Timothy Pratt. And he basically speaks to individuals who've been arrested and charged with domestic terrorism and how it impacted their lives. And so it says that, quote, before boarding a flight from San Francisco to New York last month, Luke, aka Lucky Harper, was pulled aside and subjected to a search of his body and his belongings in front of other passengers waiting to board. The experience would have been even more upsetting if it wasn't the third time in several weeks. Harper was also searched in airports in Nashville, Tennessee, and in Salt Lake City, Utah, and his name was called out on the loudspeaker. Officials swabbed his hands, seeking traces of explosives. And this is just a 27-year-old aspiring writer who had recently been released from jail in DeKalb County, Georgia, after being arrested on state domestic terrorism charges at a music festival on March 5th. And he is one of 42 people facing the same charges in Georgia in connection with the continuing protest against a planned police and fire department training center known as Cop City. So after that, another dozen or so people have been arrested and charged with felony stalking of a police officer after handing out flyers and money laundering, among other charges. Some were jailed in solitary confinement for days without explanation. And although over a year has passed since the earliest arrest, no one has been indicted. At least as of writing this, I might have to update this, but the terrorism charges have been denounced as part of a quote-unquote broader attempt to smear protesters as national security threats. And that was in a letter by the Human Rights Watch of the Amnesty International and other groups. And so, as with Harper, the lives of these arrestees have been upended. Some have lost jobs, been barred from attending school. Most are living with the psychological impacts of the criminal justice system being wielded against them with little to no publicly released evidence of having committed any crimes. At least 13 of them have posted fundraisers online to help with everything from housing to mental health. Harper was arrested after arriving at the public park near Cop City site the day before a music festival, part of a week of activities against the training center. I was there because I was curious, which is what Harper said, the person who was arrested. He had never been to the forest before. During the festival, at least 100 people walked into the woods, crossed the creek, knocked over a fence where construction of the training center had begun. Some of them threw rocks and burned equipment. Harper was arrested hours later, accused of participating in part due to his clothes being muddy and a photo allegedly showing him at the scene. But during his arrest, police separated several dozen people according to where they were from, in Georgia or elsewhere. So it was like, if you're from Georgia, you over here. If you're from elsewhere, you over there. And all 23 were arrested that day and were charged with domestic terrorism, and only 2 were Georgia residents. And so in this article, he says that this is notable because the state has consistently labeled the movement against Cop City as the work of quote-unquote outsiders, in part because of the out-of-state residence of those arrested. The arrests have also produced a chilling effect on the movement against the training center, which persists in its 3rd year and came to a global attention after police shot and unalived Manuel Tortuguita Paez Terrain. I think that's how you say it. He was an environmental protester in a January raid on the forest, the first incident of its kind in U.S. history. The state of Georgia says that the protester shot first, but video footage from the police nearby raises the possibility that one officer wounded another in the raid. A special prosecutor is evaluating the case, and the arrest marks the first time in the U.S. that state domestic terrorism charges have been brought in connection with environmental, and they've seldom been used against other protesters. And so this is where it gets kind of dicey. But the underlying statute that has been challenged in court as unconstitutionally vague, according to the attorney, Daniel L. Cohen, who filed the petition, one of the 2 prosecuting agencies, the DeKalb County District Attorney's Office, withdrew from the cases altogether in June of last year, so June of 2024, I believe. And that left the state attorney general to pursue them. But none of that has really altered the state's approach. And on May 31st of last year, Atlanta police staged a SWAT-style raid in an Atlanta neighborhood, and they entered a house with long guns drawn. They arrested Marlene Kautz and 2 colleagues of the Atlanta Solidarity Fund, one of nearly 100 similar organizations across the country that helps arrested protesters with bail, legal defense, and related needs. The 3 were charged with money laundering and other financial crimes. Within days, the judge presiding over their bail hearing said he didn't find the state's case, quote-unquote, real impressive, and Georgia's Governor Brian Kemp called the 3, quote-unquote, criminals who aided and abetted domestic terrorism. So that's how Kautz summed up the state's approach as, quote, repression that seems motivated by fear, as nothing seems to be working to slow down the movement, end quote. Having the police arrest him and his colleagues at gunpoint, taking their computers, files, phones, and other belongings have been, quote-unquote, incredibly disruptive, he said. The group also runs a project collecting and distributing tons of produce each week at a handful of Atlanta locations. Donor withdrew support for several months because of fear of getting swept up in the arrest, meaning people who counted on free food were also affected. The arrests, Kautz said, are, quote, within the legal system but outside of the trial system, to make people feel uncertain, threatened, and vulnerable at the time, end quote. Speaking on the phone during the last week of summer camp in Michigan, Charlie Tenenbaum was admiring a yellow butterfly that had landed on their hand. It was an appreciated moment of calm in nature, only weeks after being released from nearly 3 months in jail. Tenenbaum, who uses they-them pronouns, was one of 3 arrested in late April of last year for posting a flyer on mailboxes in a Bartow County neighborhood where one of the State Patrol officers who shot Tortuguita lived. The flyer called the officer a quote-unquote murderer and was addressed to the neighborhood's residents. It made no threats. Tenenbaum was arrested and charged with felony intimidating a police officer. The FBI tried to pressure them into being interviewed. For their first 4 days in jail, police kept them in solitary confinement with lights on for 24 hours. The case, quote-unquote, raises serious First Amendment concerns. The ACLU of Georgia told The Guardian at the time, quote, "It is also a part of a broader pattern of the state of Georgia weaponizing the criminal code to unconditionally protect law enforcement and to silence speech critical of the government," end quote. That's what the ACLU said. And so Tenenbaum, he was supposed to spend the summer working at the summer camp, but ultimately lost the opportunity after being denied bond several times. A prosecutor from the state's attorney general office convinced a judge in the rural county that records showing Tenenbaum had bought and been reimbursed for art supplies for a children's event at the forest near the proposed Cop City site. It was evidence that they were somehow linked to domestic terrorism, end quote. And so that's the conclusion of that entire article. Reading that article just really saddened me because some of these people who were caught up in these charges were alleging that they were just in the area of Cop City. And some were protesting, but they still should not have been arrested, let alone charged with domestic terrorism. And this just illustrates how close to impossible it feels to try and fight against a system that can have the most dire of consequences when you try and seek accountability. I don't even know what I would do if I were in that scenario because domestic terrorism, like that's serious. Like, what do you do with your life after being charged with domestic terrorism? Even if you aren't found guilty of it, that is such a heavy accusation. But just in my opinion, this isn't about justice, it's about intimidation. And to me, it's obvious that the government is trying to make an example out of the group of alleged protesters to discourage anyone else from opposing Cop City. But besides a few articles, I really couldn't find any updates on the individuals who were charged. But I hope that they are safe and are in good spirits and all that good stuff. I did start working on this script quite a while ago, so I did find one Apple News article. The most recent update that I saw was from December of 2024, and that was from the victim of the person who was unalived at Cop City. So they decided to sue the officers involved because they believe his Fourth Amendment rights were violated. So I guess we'll see how that turns out. I haven't really seen too many other recent updates. I do also feel like I can't not acknowledge everything that's going on with even more of the militarization of the police and everything that's going on with our current president of the United States and the ICE raids and him also deploying troops in cities. Like it's not surprising, but it's also really surreal living in the US as it becomes even more of a police state. And so I do want to transition and talk about Iraq and more specifically Abu Ghraib. But yeah, I think that deserves to be mentioned. But to start at the beginning, the Iraq war began after 9/11, and that was a part of the global war on terror. And there was a lot of contention about the legality and the ethics of this specific war because a lot of people felt that the invasion of Iraq was aggressive, unjustified, and violated international laws. But obviously, George Bush was all for it and in full support of the war. But there were a lot of conversations about why the war even began. I was born in 1999, so I feel like that really shaped a lot of my earlier years, just like especially how people felt about George Bush. I do remember like even as a kid how disgusted they were with Bush and how they said he was a liar, and I never understood why because I was too young to understand. But anyway, some believe it was over oil, some say it was over the intent to destroy weapons of mass destruction, or Saddam Hussein's accused support of terrorism, or all of the above. So it's a lot of different reasons why people think that he started the war. There isn't one definitive answer. But again, I don't want to dive too deep into the specifics of the war because that would be another hour of talking, and I feel like that's a whole nother video. So I feel like it might be a little bit redundant, but I can't not talk about Abu Ghraib. But if you don't know, Abu Ghraib was a maximum security prison in Iraq that was previously used by Saddam Hussein for prisoners, and it was eventually in use by the US military to hold prisoners in Iraq during the war. So first of all, a good chunk of these people were not even confirmed criminals who needed to be detained. some were innocent civilians, and things went left when the American soldiers were supposed to be in charge of the prison began torturing the prisoners, just because. And I'm sure you guys have all, again, seen the infamous hooded man photograph at some point in your lives. It is disturbing, but if not, then here it is. But this photo was on the cover of the New York Times, the New Yorker, the Economist, and multiple other major news platforms. And it was shocking to say the least, but there was so much more that was eventually uncovered. So to go into detail, the man under the hood was allegedly either Ali Shalal al-Qaisi or Abdul Hussein Saad Faleh. And there was some confusion about the identity of the specific man photographed because this was a common torture method that was used. And so that's why I said both names, because nobody knows definitively who it is. But Shalal did recall standing on a similar box with wires attached to his hands and receiving electrical shocks, which I just can't even imagine. But this was, of course, very painful, and he even alleged that he began to bleed from up under the mask. And he also noted that multiple other detainees at Abu Ghraib were naked for multiple days at a time, and that was another torture method. And there were tons of incriminating photographs that depicted the torture of the inmates and the amusement of the soldiers who were in charge. As I was researching, I saw there was another image of a naked detainee with a leash around his neck. And it was just awful, things you just can't even comprehend. I don't even know how they even conceived some of these ideas, but the torture was beyond inhumane. And there were photographs of deceased detainees who died under the supervision of the U.S. soldiers, and pictures of the naked detainees as well, with human feces smeared all over their faces and bodies. And there was also some pictures of rape, sodomy, soldiers urinating on detainees, sleep deprivation, painful shackle positions, and much, much, much more. And I mean, you can just Google the photos. It's incredibly disheartening that these photos even exist, and I can't imagine being in such a vulnerable and degraded position to that extent and being met with no compassion by the people who I'm supposed to be under their care. And because even though, in their head, oh, they're criminals, it's still the guards and the U.S. soldiers' job to keep these people safe, even if they are prisoners. Because regardless of what these prisoners were accused of, not even found guilty, but just accused of, nothing warrants this type of treatment. And it is also really frustrating that these soldiers felt so emboldened and desensitized enough to photograph such heinous behaviors. It was the fact that they did it and the fact that they photographed it on top of that. And it makes me wonder if they were so engulfed in the power trip of it all that they let go of their morals, or if they genuinely thought that they were justified and the rules didn't apply to them. And there were also more allegations of snakes and dogs being let loose on the detainees to bite the prisoners as well. And there seems to have been no stone unturned as far as torture methods go. Again, I don't even know how they thought of some of these ideas. It is just ridiculous. And there are photos of the detainees in a human pyramid, naked, and American soldiers posing next to them doing the peace sign. There are a lot of different photos of different variations of that. And it would be one of those things where you just think it can't get any worse, and then you would just see another photo and then it is worse. But I genuinely cannot imagine the mental anguish and helplessness and despair and terror that those detainees felt. And the questions that kept popping up in my head was, who was authorizing this? Because when this became public knowledge, there was a lot of finger pointing. There were soldiers who committed the actual acts of torture and fostered the environment at the prison, but they said that they were just following orders. And the people in Washington said that they weren't aware of the severity of the situation. So everybody was pointing the finger at everybody. And as I was doing my research, it was very apparent that torture isn't anything new to the U.S. Department of Defense, and it is comical that everyone was clutching their pearls. The military using torture as a means to get their quote-unquote enemies to talk has been around for a very, very long time, and this is nothing new. Torture is illegal in the United States, but as long as the Justice Department feels that it is justified, it's permitted and encouraged even. And let's not act like America has some historical moral standing when it comes to the topic of torture. If you or the people who come before you were a part of any marginalized community, the thought of the U.S. government using torture isn't a shocking phenomenon. And that goes for slavery, Native American boarding schools, mental asylums, conversion therapy, and so much more. The fact that a tragedy like this did happen, unfortunately, isn't shocking or unbelievable. The U.S. government using torture and abusing vulnerable groups who they're supposed to be, quote unquote, protecting is a systemic issue, and that's been around for ever. And then, so as I was researching again, I started to think of just like, dang, like how did this become such a normalized method for the government to obtain information? And that is where the Kubark manual comes in. Again, I have everything linked down below, and I urge y'all to view it for yourselves because the Kubark manual is, I don't have words, again, speechless. The Kubark Manual was published by the US Army and CIA in 1963, and it basically documents on how to be a quote-unquote good interrogator or torturer. But now I do understand that with interrogations, especially with people who are considered to be a danger to society, that some form of firmness and verbal aggression is probably necessary, because I'm sure that if you sat down with a criminal mastermind, they're not going to tell you what you need to hear by just asking politely. So I do understand that you need to have some sternness or whatever. But I do think that there should be a middle ground and lines that should just not be crossed. I've never interrogated anyone before. I'm not, this isn't Criminal Minds. And I've never been in a situation with such high stakes and where people are depending on you to be able to effectively interrogate. Also, besides the ethical implications, how can you be sure that the information that you're getting from an interrogation is true? Obviously, in most cases, when there is a new lead in investigation, it will be further investigated to see if it leads to a new door or to a dead end. But there have been so many cases when false confessions were given due to the suspect being under stress. But yeah, goddamn! But that makes me think, I just watched the Yoga Shop murders, and if you've seen like the actual HBO documentary, false confessions are unfortunately very common. But anyways, I'm only pointing this out because in the Kubark manual, it is encouraged to mentally break down your suspect. And I do want to clarify that they did say that a part of being a good interrogator is knowing what techniques to use on what subject, so that the session can be useful and hopefully successful. But I do want to read this small excerpt that I saw in the manual, and it is on page 65 through 66. And again, I urge you guys to check it out yourselves. Everything is linked down below. But yeah, this specific section, it says that, quote, the effectiveness of most of the non-coercive techniques depend upon their unsettling effect. The interrogation situation is in itself disturbing to most people encountering it for the first time. The aim is to enhance this effect, to disrupt radically the familiar emotional and psychological associations of the subject. When this aim is achieved, resistance is seriously impaired. There is an awe interval, which may be extremely brief, of suspended animation, a kind of psychological shock or paralysis. It is caused by a traumatic or subtraumatic experience which explodes, as it were, the world that is familiar to the subject, as well as his image of himself within that world. Experienced interrogators recognize this effect when it appears and know at this moment that the source is far more open to suggestion, far likelier to comply than he was just before he experienced the shock. End quote. That just does not sound good. And it is the far more open to suggestion part that really troubles me, because that just made me raise my eyebrows. Because what do you mean? You don't need to suggest to somebody that they did something. If they didn't, they'll admit to it. They don't need to be suggested. But yeah, suggestion doesn't give way to a confession. And so this applies to police interrogations and the military. And there have been many instances of people being charged for crimes and even having to serve time for crimes that they didn't commit due to traumatic interrogation sessions that led to false confessions. And another thing that this reminds me of is that Netflix series. It was the Victim Suspect documentary, where there were like multiple women that reported their assaults, but they ended up being charged with falsely reporting, even though they were truly assaulted. But anyways, yeah, I think you should check that out if you haven't. But yeah, that specific section of the Kubark manual just jumped out to me because it made me think of the instances where there were normal civilians who weren't even involved in the war at all, but ended up in detention centers and being interrogated as well. And I can't imagine like how traumatizing that is. And I also can't begin to imagine the frustration and despair to lose years of their life in being in confinement for something that they did not do. There were so many instances of innocent people being detained by the US government who were completely innocent. And of course, this happened at Guantanamo Bay, which will be a separate video. That is a whole other can of worms. I also came across this story NPR did on this man who was confirmed to be detained at Abu Ghraib. His name is Talib al-Mashli, and it is heartbreaking. Like, it is awful. But anyways, he was detained for 16 months, but never charged. This man described how he was stripped naked and forced to lay on a pile of other naked men. He talked about how his wife left him and took their 2 daughters due to the shame of that entire situation. And he also discussed the stigma and the shame that comes with being a victim of sexual humiliation, especially as a man, and how he was ostracized by his community. And his sons were bullied so badly at school that they were forced to drop out. He also talked about how he had severe emotional and physical trauma from his detainment and how it has, in a way, basically ruined his life. Funny enough, he actually was in support of the war before Abu Ghraib, but he was really disappointed because even after everything that happened, no one has been compensated, even though people were found guilty. And so NPR did decide to reach out to Colonel Joe Bacino, which is a spokesperson for the U.S. Central Command, and he said that, quote, the military prioritizes any claim of detainee abuse, torture, and other grave breaches alleged against service members, as well as contractors supporting combat operations, end quote. In that, quote, Abu Ghraib was a shame on those responsible, and we are saddened by Mr. Majli's story. This is a case that has already been litigated, and the responsible service members have been punished. There is no record of compensations for the victims in this case, end quote. So you mean to tell me that the U.S. military gets to detain and torture innocent civilians, and literally change the trajectory of their lives, and not even compensate the victims? Like, that is writing a check is literally the very least you could do. And there have, of course, been multiple cases of innocent civilians being detained by the U.S. military for years and decades even, and then being released with no charges filed. And it's just expected that life is just supposed to continue when, that's just not how it works. That's not reality. And being incarcerated is completely different than being detained by the U.S. military. Usually, if you're incarcerated, that means you're accused of a crime, and then there's some type of litigation or judgment that results in a person having to serve a sentence. But the U.S. military has found a few loopholes in the Geneva Convention that can be abused to legally detain people because it is suspected that said person is associated with terrorism for whatever reason. And that is where it becomes a very slippery slope, because an innocent civilian could just be in the area or the wrong place or the wrong time, or in the right place at the right time, because this is their homeland. And yeah, they could be captured and tortured for years with no trial date or charges. And I would just, again, it's just something I just can't even imagine. I would just feel so defeated, because how do you even begin to pick up the pieces of your life and continue? And there was so much fallout, obviously, from the invasion of Iraq and the tragedy that was Abu Ghraib. But I feel that for the most part, it was kind of just like a PR disaster for the U.S. military. And there were some changes and corrections that were implemented after this period. But generally speaking, at least in my opinion, the people who were affected the most were left out to dry and really didn't get any real justice. And of course, this can be applied to the innocent civilians whose lives were turned upside down, but this can also be applied to people who served in the military and who experienced really traumatizing events and weren't adequately supported by an organization that they dedicated their lives to. And that is where we go into SA in the military. Because to say that the U.S. military has a sexual assault problem would be an understatement. The U.S. military is just a microcosm of the rest of the country and the rest of the world, but these men and women who choose to dedicate their lives to an organization that's supposed to value camaraderie over everything end up having even more trauma than what they bargained for when they return home, or don't. And I won't detail any specific situations because I don't know what you can or can't say here on this platform, and also it's just very triggering. These situations are just awful, but I am going to put a little note on the screen, a sticky note of different situations and names that I think you guys should Google. A couple of them, like Vanessa Gillian and things of the sort, those are pretty new-ish, but there are just so many different incidents that unfolded where the victims did not receive their justice. But yeah, I think you guys should look up some of these names and situations if you want to know more about it. And I think that that's a good starting point. But a documentary that I think y'all should check out, if you haven't already, is called The Invisible War. I think it's on HBO, but Corey's experience specifically really infuriated me. The entire thing was just frustrating. But her specifically, it broke my heart. But she experienced a terrible trauma, which was also frustrating because it could have possibly been prevented if her worries didn't fall on deaf ears. But in the midst of her assault, her assailant hit her so hard that he basically broke her jaw. And throughout the documentary, we see the physical, psychological, and emotional toll that this takes on her. But also, that pain is an aching reminder of her assault and the trauma. And I'm sure she would like to move forward and recover from that. Throughout the documentary, we also see how debilitating just the injury itself is, and she gets to the point where she can only eat soft foods like Jello and soup and things of the sort. due to her not receiving the proper care that she deserves. And so, the U.S. military does have their own healthcare system or whatever. I want to say it's called like the VA, Veterans Affairs, something like that. But, again, it's a microcosm of the rest of the country. So, healthcare here in the U.S. isn't that great. There are still wait lists, approvals, and denials and disappointments. This is why Luigi has a fan club. It just appears for this organization to, in a way, force survivors to kind of slip through the cracks, because there are so many things that happen after sexual assault that the survivor is forced to cope with minimal to no support, and it is just sad. And this could also just be a fear of retaliation, not being believed, the shitty healthcare system, along with the physical, mental, and emotional weight that one can carry after such a devastating violation, coupled with whatever trauma that is associated with serving in the military. And so that is a lot, but there have been too many instances of these survivors being left out in the dry, because it's easier to just not acknowledge and to avoid the fallout that would be inevitable if each violation were properly investigated. Because again, first it's the initial crime, and then it's the alleged cover-ups, and then the lack of support for the victim, and that's just not a good look for the U.S. military. So they rather ignore this problem, allegedly. And there have been some changes for the better on how the military handles these accusations. I do want to say that the I Am Vanessa Guillen Act was passed in 2022 after, I'm sure you guys have heard of it, but if not, Vanessa Guillen was a soldier at Fort Hood, which was renamed Fort Cavazos or Cavazos. I'm not sure how you pronounce it. But she was unalived after reporting her assault back in 2020. And also on the Department of Defense website, back in May 24, there was a report released that said that, quote, the rates of unwanted sexual contact affecting active component women decreased from 8.4 to 6.8 between 2021 and 2023. Rates of unwanted sexual contact affecting active component men appear to also decrease from 1.5 to 1.3%, but the change was not statistically significant. In total, nearly 7,000 fewer service members experienced sexual assault in 2023 than in 2021, according to DoD estimates, end quote. So this is great news. They're trying to implement some sort of change, and so this is great. However, in August of 2024, NBC News published an article that kind of refuted the numbers on the DoD website. And there was an article by Phil Helsel and Courtney Cube that said that, quote, the study completed by the Cost of War Project at Brown University's Watson Institute compared Defense Department data on sexual assaults with data that was not from the DoD to estimate sexual assault figures in the military since 2001. Quote, during and beyond the 20 years of the post-9/11 wars, independent data suggests that the actual sexual assault prevalence is 2 to 4 times higher than DoD estimations. 75,569 cases in 2021 and 73,695 cases in 2023, end quote. That's what the authors wrote in the report, which was released Wednesday, and Defense Department figures estimate that there were approximately 35,900 cases in 2021 and around 29,000 military personnel assaulted in 2023, the study said. The Brown report said that independent study shows higher estimates of the number of active duty service members experiencing sexual assault, and they compared those studies with the Defense Department numbers, end quote. So yeah, honestly, especially in these times with who we have in office, take anything on any government website with a grain of salt. The thing that's so unfortunate specifically about assault in the U.S. military is that it isn't as simple as hopefully getting a new job or transferring to a different location. Assault is already such a slippery slope, whether or not if you're in the military, because reporting doesn't mean that you'll be taken seriously or protected. But also, I'm assuming that if you're in the military, it will be more complicated because you can't just say, fuck it, I'm going home. It's not like that. I just can't imagine the people who are supposed to be protecting you, or you're supposed to be protecting them as well on a day-to-day basis, could be abusive, and that can make the victim a target. They're isolated, and there could be dire repercussions for attempting to even get justice, especially in an environment like that. Before I end this video, I do want to touch on the predatory recruitment practices of the U.S. military, and also how they still treat some of their veterans as well who have already served. I remember in high school, during the lunch periods, there was always a table set up, usually for colleges to come and visit, but also there was always a table set up for the military as well. And they were there at least 3 to 4 times a week. every single week. They were always there trying to hopefully recruit graduating seniors, and I have always really felt conflicted about this. They did not get me, thank God. I always felt really conflicted about it because these are soon to be young adults who have the agency to make decisions for themselves, just like how some choose to go to college or choose to do a trade or choose to just go straight into the workforce. But I just feel like it's more complicated than that. Again, my high school, personally, it was full of minorities who come from middle to lower class socioeconomic backgrounds. And so for some who felt like college wasn't an option due to finances, they did have the opportunity to enlist in the military. And I think that's good to have if you have options, but it just seems predatory in just how they went about it. And I don't necessarily think it's the military's fault for providing an option to young adults who don't want to go to college directly after high school, or who feel that the military is the best option for a decent life. I just wish that there were better options, which isn't necessarily, again, like that isn't solely the military's fault, but I just don't like how they recruit at high schools. And also, I just personally think if somebody wants to make such a big life-changing decision like joining the military, that should be something that they are made aware of as an option, but it should be their responsibility to seek that out. I just feel like it would be better and okay if the military went to different schools, like maybe once or twice a year, just to let graduating seniors know that that is an option. But it seems predatory when the same recruiters are at the same tables during the same lunch periods every single day. Like, it just feels weird, and they're always targeting marginalized, poor minority students. But they'll say things like, if you enlist, then you'll be able to afford college and you'll be financially set for life. I don't know. It almost sounds like a pyramid scheme or something. Like it'd be given MLM, but it sounds alluring when you don't have any other real options. But that isn't always the case. A person isn't guaranteed a certain amount of money or benefits just because they join the military. And also, you still have the probability of experiencing racism, sexism, harassment, hazing, and bullying when you join. So I don't think that the trade-off is worth it, even if you do receive the best of the benefits. That's just my opinion, though. That's why I didn't do it. It was never an option for me. Yeah, but yeah. Before I wrap this up, I do also want to highlight an article that I came across on Prism.org by Roberto Camacho, and he says that, quote, "While the military has a number of different approaches to entice potential recruits, the prospect of funding for college has been among one of the key quote-unquote benefits recruiters have used to entice students leery of becoming trapped under a mountain of student debt." They also explained how recruiters will often use distorted financial incentives to sway students into enlistment because they know that money to pay for college is a key motivator, especially in low-wage communities where youth are underrepresented in higher education. In fact, college benefits for many military personnel aren't guaranteed and depend on the circumstances around one's discharge from the military. Quote, "You have to get a full, honorable discharge in order to access those benefits," end quote, said Kate Connell, which is a former executive director and one of the co-founders of Truth in Recruitment. She says that, quote, "If you get a gentle discharge or even a medical discharge, you'll lose those benefits," end quote. Also, the promise of potential citizenship is another tactic that military recruiters often dangle before potential recruits who are undocumented, but the military doesn't and can't grant U.S. citizenship directly to undocumented people. This is handled by an entirely different government agency, end quote. And so there's that on that. Anyways, I would suggest that if you are planning on joining the military, then make sure you have as much information as possible and don't just join. There are so many other options. I do know it's hard out here, but also it's your life, so do whatever you want with it. And be sure that you're doing everything that you can to get the most out of your benefits, because I think that after dedicating one's life to an organization, you should be taken care of when you're discharged. But of course, that isn't always the case. There are far too many homeless veterans. But if you are a veteran and you are struggling with homelessness, first and foremost, thank you for your service. And some organizations that I found that you can check out is the National Coalition for Homeless Veterans, or NCHV.org. You can also contact or visit your nearest Veterans Affairs office. I'm not sure how speedy that'll be, but they do have resources that are there. And also, I did have a list of some different organizations that you can check out if you were affected by any of the topics discussed today. But yeah, I did see Protect Our Defenders, Veteran Sisters, Survivors United, the Headstrong Project, and the Wounded Warriors Project. So yeah, check those out if you guys are struggling with anything related to being in the military, or if you felt that anything in this video resonated with you. I feel like this is like kind of an abrupt ending, but yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Hopefully you found some of this information useful, and yeah, let me know what you think. Yeah, thank you guys so much for watching. Be sure to check out my clothing brand, Main Character The Label, my makeup brand, Box Office Beauty, and the blog, planetsyd.net. And yeah, thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you guys feel safe and seen wherever you are, and I hope you guys are finding joy and fulfillment on your journey of self-expression. Until next time.